The Doctor and Romana continued to stare in shocked silence at the fourth Time Lord, or at least Gallifreyan, they had seen that day, counting themselves. The Doctor's granddaughter stepped further inside the makeshift cell, this repurposed storeroom deep inside the Anubis monument on Cairo. She pulled the door to, but not entirely closed, lest it latched and trap those she had so recently freed along with herself. She also, no doubt, hoped to reduce the chances of being discovered by the Rani's reanimated Albion guards. The jailbreak concealed to her satisfaction, she now turned to fully face Romana and the Doctor, looking serious and a touch saddened. If she had been human, her appearance would have fallen under the category of mature, albeit healthy. To earthly eyes she could have been anywhere from 60 to 100. Her Gallifreyan ancestry obviously clouded the exact number of years she owned. While clearly her first regeneration, this still held the potential to extend into the scale of centuries. Nevertheless, even by Gallifreyan standards, she must have been around for a while. Certainly significantly far removed from the 16 years she had had when the Doctor last saw her. "Susan, The Doctor rasped, then trailed off, unusually lost for words. The extraordinary nature of this meeting robbing even him of coherent thought.
"Yes, grandfather?"
Susan responded questioningly. She passed back the responsibility of filling the silence. The Doctor looked pained by this unwelcome responsibility. "Susan, I was always going to come back for you," he finally supplied earnestly. Susan cocked her head at the Doctor.
"Really?"
she asked quizzically, yet pointedly.
"Was that before or after you were dead?"
The Doctor looked flustered. "Before, obviously. I have not broken my word," he blustered. Susan folded her arms across her chest.
"Cutting it a bit fine, aren't we? I mean, you're hardly a spring chicken now, are you?"
The Doctor coughed, and his mouth opened and closed frantically. Before he could actually find any words, Susan took the lead.
"My apologies, grandfather. Perhaps my question was unfair. Perhaps I should have asked, before or after I was dead. After all, as you can see, it's been quite some time,"
she said significantly. The Doctor's head fell, all bluster and defence finally defeated. "Susan, my dear girl, I am sorry. I failed you," he admitted glumly. Susan shook her head slowly, a hint of a weary smile tugging at her mouth.
"Oh, grandfather, dear grandfather. There are so many bones to be picked with you, each buried in the ashes of the past. We could be here for an eternity discussing them, I fear. And yet, I suspect we do not have the time. One more sad price for your tardiness. Nevertheless, Dr. Mine, you have your strengths, you have your weaknesses. You tried to do what you thought was best, however questionable those thoughts might have been. We are all ultimately, eventually, mortal and flawed. And I forgive you."
The Doctor's eyes snapped up in shock and disbelief. Susan walked towards him a little stiffly, as if parts of her were trying to hold her back. Her better self won through, however, and she embraced her grandfather, even if a little reservedly. The Doctor, eyes still wide in a mixture of panic and confusion, returned the hug awkwardly, complete with 3 pats of his right hand to her back. The motions of reconciliation completed, at least partially, and for the time being, they released each other and took a step back. Romana had remained silent the entire time, not wishing to encroach upon this most emotional and difficult of meetings. Now, though, she felt it would be ruder to remain silent.
I am Romana.
She began, extending a hand towards Susan.
I read about you before my first ever encounter with your grandfather. It is a pleasure to finally meet you in the flesh.
Susan took a step towards Romana, a weary and knowing faint smile stealing upon her lips. She took her hand.
So you read about me as research?
Susan asked pointedly as she shook the other Time Lord's outstretched limb, then released it.
I don't suppose my grandfather actually mentioned me himself,
she added. The doctor looked downcast once more, while even Romana found it hard to find the words to elegantly continue the conversation. Susan shook her head with that same wistful expression.
I'm sorry,
she offered calmly.
There's no need to answer that. I know I said I forgive him, but there are so many demons to put to rest, I fear they may still growl from time to time.
Romana nodded her understanding.
Obviously, we are very grateful for your timely rescue.
Romana began, still polite.
But how exactly did you come to be here to rescue us? Have you been searching long?
Susan's eyebrows raised a little at Romana's attempt at tact.
You mean, have I been searching for him ever since he abandoned me on Earth in 2164?
The doctor spread his hands wide. My dear child, I only did what I thought was best. I am sorry if I erred. Susan's head dipped towards the doctor.
Yes, Grandfather, you were very eloquent while explaining it to me at the time. A most beautiful speech. I only wish I'd been given the opportunity to deliver a rebuttal. Perhaps face to face, inside the TARDIS.
Once again the doctor looked crestfallen. Susan waved her head and held up her hands placatingly.
Sorry. Once again. Demons, you know.
Then she returned her attention to Romana to expand upon her earlier answer.
No, I didn't immediately set out in pursuit of our doctor here, even if I'd had the slightest idea how to begin such a course. No, I determined to make a life with David, much as Grandfather had suggested, though not because of that. David was a good man, an easy man to love and be loved by. We made a life together as the earth rebuilt itself and were happy for a while. He suited me very well in those early days, and I know he adored me.
Romana nodded thoughtfully.
Sounds idyllic, I'm sure. And yet I sense it did not last.
Susan shook her head.
Oh no, it lasted very well, for several years. But ultimately something grew in me, which took it all from me. At first it seemed we saw everything through the same eyes. We laughed at the same silly things, enjoyed a myriad of pleasant diversions and memories together. But then the differences crept in. I began to see more and more of the universe that he couldn't. I began to envision things of which he could not even begin to imagine, no matter how much he tried. And oh, how he tried. But ultimately we were living in different worlds. We three are Time Lords, inhabitants of all time and space, and mere humans cannot truly share in our experiences. They can't, in truth and fullness, share their lives with the likes of us, or vice versa. It's cruel to expect that of them, and cruel to expect it of me.
Here she stared challengingly into the doctor's eyes.
Why didn't you see this before you left me there? You, worldly wise, my guardian, my protector, my Time Lord grandfather. Why didn't you know this would happen?
As Susan demanded answers, the doctor returned her gaze mute, his own thoughts a mystery. Perhaps seeking to help him out a little, Romana responded.
You and your grandfather are more alike than you know. Your own words betray that, in ways I don't think even you comprehend. And at the same time, I know he did not intend to deceive you, any more than he intended to deceive himself. He has had quite an odd relationship with humans himself over the years, even until quite recently, into his dotage, so to speak. He is learning, but slowly. Try not to treat him too harshly.
Susan cocked her head at the other female Time Lord, as if seeing her clearly for the first time.
I think perhaps he's finally found the right travelling companion, one who will not let his foolishness stand.
Romana waggled her head in forced modesty.
Well, you know, I have my moments.
Susan continued to study her keenly.
And you have, perhaps, also found the perfect travelling companion in him. Someone patient enough to share their wisdom with you, however unwelcomed.
Romana frowned at Susan, while the doctor showed the faintest hint of a smile, the first sign of good humour since setting eyes on his granddaughter.
Yes, well,
Romana continued brusquely.
Critiques of the companions from the travelling TARDIS out of the way. Perhaps you could return to your travels, and how you got here.
Susan chuckled.
It is good to be among Gallifreyans again.
She began.
Although I've augmented my Time Lord knowledge and skills over the years, even in absentia, even without the Academy to guide and aid me, it's good to finally be back amongst my own kind.
Do you have a TARDIS? The Doctor asked. This was the first thing he had said which was neither an apology or defence. His mind was clearly returning to more immediate matters. Susan shook her head.
Unfortunately not. As you can see, I eventually left Earth and David, but initially I had to use far more mundane and crude forms of transport, travelling only through space under power and through time via aging. I began to pick up hints of your existence, Grandfather, myths and legends in your wake. Eventually I did manage to acquire some time bracelets, non-Gallifreyan, of course, and primitive by our standards, but at least I could begin to track your movements a little more effectively. And then the universe shattered.
Romana and the Doctor shared significant glances.
Oh, I know you. Well, at least the Doctor would be involved somehow. I even guessed he might be the cause, from the research I managed while tracing your footsteps. I'm almost certain of it now. Then the universe was repaired, but still I followed the trail, until at last I finally saw you on the landing field here on Cairo. Alas, I paused too long and lost you yet again.
The Doctor nodded sympathetically. I'm sorry we were in such a rush. We thought our major troubles were behind us and were itching to explore the universe in our newfound freedom. Obviously, we didn't realize how wrong we were, he said, gesticulating at their prison cell deep within the base of the Rani.
Well, all's well that ends well,
Susan concluded briskly.
I found you eventually.
Romana frowned once more.
But how did you do that? Did you follow us off-world again as we explored space-time?
Susan's head waggled from side to side.
In the end, I didn't have to.
She explained, smiling, holding up one wrist to reveal a time bracelet.
This thing is good for short trips, although for longer journeys it does require frequent recharging. But in this case, its secondary function rendered such travel unnecessary.
The Doctor's curiosity was piqued. Really? How so?
These things have very basic detectors for time disturbances other than their own. I upgraded this one, using my own time tech skills, to make it a little bit more precise and detailed. I was in the middle of trying to track where you'd gone, and was just narrowing down the exact coordinates about an hour and a half after you left, when the temporal disturbance detector went off, and quite insistently. It had picked up an unusually disturbing anomaly. A TARDIS. Your TARDIS, arriving back on Cairo. But inside another TARDIS. Well, not quite another TARDIS, but something eerily similar.
The Doctor and Romana both nodded. The satellite and the time terminus. The Doctor supplied helpfully. Susan gave a thumbs up.
Yep, I've been nosing around here for a while, found the satellite, saw your TARDIS inside at first, saw and avoided those unhealthy-looking guards. Then I finally saw them taking you down here. So I liberated Key, and voila, here I am.
So you are not yet aware who is behind all this?
Romana asked. Susan nodded, but before she could respond further, the Doctor leapt in with another question. Wait, the TARDIS was inside the satellite at first? He asked with concern.
Yes, they took it out before sending the satellite to, well, wherever they sent it in time and space.
The Doctor frowned. Ah, so the TARDIS is still inside the time terminus.
No, they moved it into a workshop beyond the rear of the chamber, in preparation for stripping.
The Doctor looked aghast. They put my TARDIS in Anubis's rear? For stripping, no less? This shall not stand! He cried indignantly. Susan frowned at him.
What exactly is going on? And what exactly are we going to do?
And so the Doctor explained about the Rani and her plans. Susan listened intently as he outlined the nature of the battery, the repurposing of the monument, expounded on the bulk, its powers and the Rani's, and how they were all connected to each other and the satellites. By the time he had finished, Susan looked pensive.
This is beginning to feel like a Time Lord convention. only one with very lax security. The Rani sounds like a complete maniac.
The doctor nodded somberly. And not the good kind either. You see now what we're up against and what we have to prevent. Susan nodded curtly.
So, where do we begin?
Romana asked, concerned. The doctor stroked his chin. Where indeed? Well, not here, and that's for sure. We must get the TARDIS back and get out. Then, and I am loath to say this, as it smacks of brute force, we must find aid. Sufficient personnel to assault this battery and disable it. Before it is plugged into the bulk.
I fear you may be right. But where, or even when, do you hope to find your army?
I believe we may already have what we need to hand. First, I propose we take the TARDIS on a short trip to Cairo Aerodrome. Susan frowned.
That sounds unusually precise for you, Grandfather. Have you finally learnt how to control the TARDIS?
No.
Romana replied quickly. The doctor frowned at them. My piloting skills have come a long way over the centuries. He began indignantly.
And in various unexpected directions.
Romana added mischievously. The doctor rolled his eyes. And, he continued through gritted teeth, I can pilot through space-time far more accurately than I admit I once did. Sensing further objections, he held up his hand to forestall them. Nevertheless, I am not proposing we travel in time, merely shift spatial location slightly. I can do short spatial hops under total control. It's just the longer space-time journeys which sometimes go a little awry. He insisted.
Sometimes,
Susan said, a little sceptically.
A little?
Romana added in a similar tone. Affirmative, Master, K9 supplied helpfully. The doctor harumphed at this trio of tormentors. If you have all quite finished, I shall explain what we shall do once we successfully arrive. Susan and Romana nodded pleasantly, stifling smirks. Once there, I suggest we find and contact Lou Halberd and Nathan Ivon, our friends from the Albion Imperial Museum. With their connection to Sir Arthur Buchan back at the museum itself, and by extension the Albion authorities, coupled with our growing reputation for both predicting and dealing with wrongdoings, we should be able to rustle up the forces required. Romana and Susan signified their acceptance of his plan. I just hope we don't end up embedded in some Albion alternate unit outfit. I really don't think I could bear that sort of thing again. The doctor, Romana, Susan and K9 crept out of the makeshift cell. Much as when Susan had arrived, there were no reanimated henchpeople in the corridor for now. So they continued on to the stairwell. Hearing nothing, they began to mount the single 2-meter-wide set of stone steps. They had almost reached the next landing when they heard multiple footfalls trudging down the stairs from the landing above that. The 3 Time Lords looked at one another in panic. There were 2 parallel sets of steps leading down from the floor above, but which was in use? Or worse, were both?
Doctor, which way?
Romana cried in hushed tones. Quickly, left! He responded, similarly muted.
Are you sure?
Romana hissed back. The doctor simply widened his eyes and shrugged helplessly. With no other plan, the 3 Gallifreyans and the robot dog dashed onto the landing, then immediately off it into the left-hand flight of stairs. Fortunately, there were no Albion undead here. Nevertheless, they all froze, attempting to remain silent. They heard a modest group of individuals trudging onto the landing they had just evacuated, then down the stairs they had previously ascended. They all breathed a sigh of relief. Well, all except K9, who had no need. No matter their good fortune, the doctor was not about to let them rest on their laurels. Hurry! He gasped, grabbing Romana and Susan by an arm each and encouraging them up the new run of stairs. Doubtless those guards were sent to check on us. Our absence will be discovered in moments. We must make haste. They rapidly reached the next landing and were immediately faced by the open door to the time terminus. Peering carefully through that opening, they saw the vast chamber beyond. As Susan had said, the satellite had vanished, fully exposing the ancient room in all its glory. They could see the opposite wall, which looked virtually identical to the one they were staring through. Another dim open door at its centre, flanked by grey cuboid time portals, 2 to each side. The side walls of the time terminus were now also unobstructed. While they had no open doors, such as the end walls, they did house 6 more time portals each, spaced out along their extended lengths. Other than this, there was nothing else of note within the chamber. Fortunately, this also included hench beings. As quietly as possible, the quartet of travellers hustled across the time terminus, making for the far door, through which they hoped to find the TARDIS. They burst into this opening without stopping, dashing into the TARDIS decommissioning workshop beyond. Understandable as their keenness and haste may have been, it proved to be unwise. A strange and particularly upsetting pair of reanimated Albion corpses turned away from the TARDIS they had been working on, the Doctor and Romana's TARDIS, and glared dully at the trio of Time Lords plus K9. One was a woman with the foreshortened limbs of a 9-year-old child, while the other was a 9-year-old child with the elongated arms and legs of an adult. Both wore matching and now ill-fitting white dresses with black cardigans and bonnets, the bizarre unnatural fusion of mother and child. Each of these altered undead servants were holding devices of distinctly un-Albion origins, one looking like a probe of some sort, the other a more aggressive-looking implement. Both appeared to be based upon Gallifreyan technology. Luckily, it seemed neither device had had any effect on the TARDIS thus far. Unluckily, they did appear quite heavy, particularly as the jumbled duo hefted them and advanced upon the Time Lords. Romana spotted her sword stick leaning against a nearby workbench. The Rani's guards had confiscated it prior to escorting them to their leader, and had undoubtedly simply stored it with their TARDIS by association. She made a dash for it, past the diminutive mother, who narrowly missed her with a swing of her makeshift club. Meanwhile, the former 9-year-old on adult legs staggered towards Susan and the Doctor, swinging her own weapon menacingly towards them. Grandfather and granddaughter both backed away slowly, each wondering what strategy would serve them best. At that moment, a strange humming noise arose, increasing in both pitch and intensity. A roughly cuboid grey shape, about a metre long, flew through the air from behind the relatives. It struck the Albion elongated corpse full in the chest, sending both sailing back to collide with the TARDIS. The hench being slid to the floor and remained there, motionless. The grey object rose straight up to hover around 3 feet in the air. It was, of course, K9.
My nose laser may still be inoperative, Master, Mistress, but the nose is fully functional,
he reported primly. Meanwhile, the mother had been distracted by the commotion and had turned to discover the fate of her daughter. Doubtless there were no maternal feelings remaining in this mobile corpse, its only dull interest being how effectively it, or rather they, were serving their mistress. Whatever the motivation, Romana took advantage of the creature's loss of focus and clubbed it roughly across the back of its head with the brass handle of her sword cane. Then she repeated this several more times until it finally stopped moving, barring a few twitches.
Well done, Romana, K9.
The Doctor congratulated them approvingly, unable to mask how impressed he was.
Now let us board the TARDIS while we still have the chance.
With that, he strode to the TARDIS doors, and with a click had them whirring open. They all dashed on board, the doors sealing behind them. As soon as they had reached the main console, the Doctor began programming the coordinates for Cairo Aerodrome, present time. Just as the Doctor prepared to throw the launch lever, they all heard a ragged screech of rage. The rage of the Rani. They could see no sign of her on the TARDIS monitors. She was not in the workshop with their vessel, it seemed. In all likelihood, she was still in her throne room in the head of Anubis, and had been amplified by her bulk-gleaned powers. The Doctor threw the launch lever desperately. The familiar sounds of dematerialization began, the central column rising and falling. Then a shudder ran through the timeship as a similar but competing sound arose from outside. There now came a scraping sound as of metal upon metal.
She's activated the time terminus,
the Doctor cried frantically.
She's redirecting the energies of the time portals upon us here, trying to hold the old girl in place.
Can we pull away?
Romana asked, frowning. The doctor shook his head.
Not as things currently stand, no,
he said somberly. Then his eyes widened as a realization struck him.
The emergency power booster unit,
he shouted excitedly.
Of course.
Romana responded, equally enthused.
Where is it?
Under that square flap there, under the panel you're resting on, next to your left hand,
the doctor explained excitedly.
Romana found the cover and raised it.
Underneath was a large red button on a white background, labelled in white.
Why does it say turbo boost on it?
Romana asked dubiously.
I mean, the TARDIS doesn't use turbos in its engines. What have you been doing?
She added. The doctor frowned impatiently at her.
I renamed it to that because, at the time, I thought it was cool. You know, like bow ties. Obviously, I no longer do, for either,
he told her grumpily. Then he thumped the button. The usual TARDIS engine notes were joined by another soaring, whooshing sound. The sounds of scraping metal subsided. They were flying free. Moments later, they landed. The doctor, Romana, Susan and K9 tumbled out onto the sun-baked, dry and dusty expanse of Cairo Aerodrome landing field beneath the airship mooring masts.
Right, now to contact our friends from the museum.
There was a crack, like a single terrifying clap of thunder, one so fundamental it went beyond loud, almost as if it could be felt, resonating through every fibre of their beings. They all looked up at the sky and gasped in horror. The sky was peppered, or rather gashed, with objects of various sizes, but all of a type, and one which the doctor, Romana and K9 were all too familiar with.
We're too late.
The doctor's hushed words fell as heavy as headstones, while they stared grimly at the opening rifts to the bulk. The largest of these floated above where they knew the Anubis monument stood, although from where they were, their view was almost entirely obstructed by low hills. All they could make out were the tips of its ears. As for the rift, it was all too visible. It hung like a ragged tear in reality itself, like the widening maw of some vertical shining clam. Its lower tip looked as though it might be 200 meters above the ears of Anubis, although it was difficult to judge its actual elevation due to the uncertain distance to this dread phenomenon. It stretched upwards, covering 20 degrees of sky, widening towards its center, then narrowing to its upper tip. Inside the tear was the stuff of nightmares. Within its jagged boundaries twisted a sickening sea of chaos, almost as if every color, every sound, every sensation clamored to exist at once, simultaneously, in this horrific hallucination. Yet the Time Lords knew only too well how real these visions were. And this maddening jumble of images, and more, was repeated across the sky countless times, though none matched the first for apparent size. This, however, was the true illusion, their variation in scale simply a product of their relative distances scattered throughout the cosmos.
The Rani has activated the battery,
Romana cried in dismay. The doctor nodded grimly.
I'm afraid so. She has linked all the satellites she seeded across space-time. Doubtless there are innumerable rifts, not simply spread out among the stars, but also strewn through the centuries and millennia.
I assume you think our Albion army would be pointless now?
Susan asked, although suspecting the answer. The doctor inclined his head in somber affirmation.
So, and I know I hardly ever ask this. What now, Doctor? Any more ideas?
The doctor smiled at her humour, but his demeanour remained serious.
I have one more, yes, but I fear you may not like it,
he said warningly. Romana tipped her forehead towards the doctor and spread her hands wide.
Well?
She invited him to elaborate. The doctor pointed casually towards one of the mooring pylons.
Well, first I think we should say hello to one of our dear old friends over there, even if he is not one of those I'd previously thought of.
Romana and Susan followed the line of his finger. The mooring tower was one which still held the A-36 airship, spaceship of the Albion Imperial Space Service.
This remarkable vehicle shared many superficial similarities with earthly airships of the 1920s and 30s, including 6 turboprop engines attached to its fared-in gondola. Obviously, these motors were a little more advanced than their earthly counterparts, but this was far from its most remarkable deviation. As well as being able to support an atmosphere for interplanetary travel, it was their means of propulsion in space itself which was most astounding. Retractable panels of a most marvelous material, cavorite, allowed them to reverse the effects of gravity, pushing them from planet to planet. Right now, it was not the vessel, tethered by its nose to the tower, which held the attention of the Doctor and his companions. It was the man in smart Navy officer attire standing at the tower's base. The Doctor strode over to him, his surprised companions trailing and trundling in his wake.
"Oh, hello,"
the Albion officer cried affably.
"The Doctor, isn't it? And Miss Romana. So delighted to see you all again. Oh, I say, did you forget something on board?"
His broad smile had morphed to confused concern by his last question, as he peered out from under his white-peaked cap. The Doctor clapped him on the dark blue shoulder of his military jacket. "Sub-Lieutenant Leslie's," the Doctor began, as friendlily as he could manage given the desperate circumstances. "I cannot express just how delighted we are to see you and your magnificent vessel. But fear not, we have not left anything on board. Yet." The Time Lord's final word was delivered with an oddly laboured significance. Before anyone could pursue its deeper meaning, all were distracted by a new horror from above. Something was snaking out of one of the nearer bulk rifts. Not the largest of them, but this reduced proximity did nothing to soften the blow. A giant tentacle nosed its way into Chiroan airspace from the 11-dimensional realm of all existence. It was obvious, even from their limited view they had of this insane world through the tear, that this otherworldly appendage was attached to a monstrous entity of unimaginable size, festooned with such serpentine extremities. The colour of this beast, as much as 4-dimensional minds could comprehend, was ever shifting and sickening to behold. It sometimes appeared a glistening brown, at other times a scaly green, then in brief flashes crystalline in rainbow hues. Like some nightmare alien bullet train, this limb of a bulk denizen curled and pushed across the sky. Then the tip found another rift and entered that. For a time it seemed the pulsing, writhing member were pushing deeper and deeper into that second tear in the fabric of space and time. Then the tip exited from the first rift. This was in no way which made sense to those watching. It was not as if the tip had curled around within the bulk to appear once more next to its own tentacle. No, it looked now as if the tentacle was being withdrawn from the first rift and retracted into the second, where it was now attached to the bloated body of the bulk entity. This made no sense at all in 4 dimensions, and yet no doubt was just another Thursday to these denizens of the 11-dimensional whole.
"Oh, I say,"
Sub-Lieutenant Leslie's piped up, troubled, but obviously trying to place a brave face over his confusion.
"Bally queer weather for the time of year, wouldn't you say?"
The Doctor raised his eyebrows and looked upon the unfortunate Albion with resigned disappointment. "Yes, bally queer. Outbreaks of Armageddon with a slight chance of apocalypse," he forecast witheringly. Philip Leslie simply continued to beam at him and nodded in agreement. In fairness to the hapless sub-lieutenant, it did seem the rifts were affecting the weather to some degree, beyond their unsettling added illumination and the odd airborne tentacle. The wind had picked up, causing sudden gusts of hot, dusty desert air to scud in random directions. "Mr. Leslie's," the Doctor continued, "we need to speak to Captain Povey about the A-36. Do you know where he is?" Philip looked unsure of himself.
"Oh, well, I'm sure he also left the ship a while ago. Like me. I think he just wanted to take the air before passengers were allowed on board and whatnot. Funny thing, I haven't seen him for a while, almost as if he were avoiding me. But of course that would be ridiculous. As you know, we get on very well," he finished, smiling once more.
Very well? The doctor asked. Before the officer could answer, there was a crash of a tin door being opened forcibly. About 20 meters away stood the temporary metal shack currently assigned as a small temple to Osiris for the use of the native workers. It was the door to this which had been opened, then caught by the wind and slammed against the temple wall. Standing in the doorway, holding onto his peaked white cap for all it was worth, was Captain Povey himself. Frowning hard and looking less than pleased, he strode towards the doctor and his companions. "Captain Povey," the doctor began cheerily as he arrived. "Delighted to see you again. I had no idea you were a devotee of Osiris." The captain's frown deepened and he harumphed, looking momentarily uncomfortable.
Well, I'm not, actually. I was just looking for somewhere to get out of this damned heat and sun. Then there was the added benefit of getting some peace, particularly from my esteemed first officer. Naturally, he was not about to let that last. I could hear him talking to you even from in there, fraternizing with someone who has troubled our little ship on several occasions, compounding his disturbance,
he said crossly, before turning his full attention upon the sub-lieutenant.
You really are the Albion's burden.
Oh, sir, really? I do try.
Leslie's whined, sounding a little hurt.
Oh, yes,
the captain agreed heartily.
You're very trying.
Then he spun once more upon the doctor.
Now what exactly do you want with me?
He growled.
Or more worryingly, my ship.
The doctor raised his finger, about to reveal all, when his thunder was stolen. A boom resounded through the air, coming from the direction of the twin peaks of Anubis's ears. From between those barely visible stone pinnacles rose a curling column of black and oily smoke. This unhealthy-looking vapour trail arced up into the sky, bending towards the Time Lords and Albions as it went, its cause being propelled in their direction. As it grew closer, it became clear that the single oily trail was in fact two such lines of exhaust, only combining as they expanded in the thing's wake. These twin jets came from the palms of human-looking hands pointed towards the feet of this flying being. It was, of course, the Rani. She came to rest, floating in the air in front of the Time Lords, but still some distance away, perhaps twice the altitude of the moored A-36 and a good 50 meters in front of its nose. "Rani," the doctor called up with forced conviviality. "How good of you to join us. You're looking well." This last statement was not simply an attempt by the doctor to butter up the bulk-fueled Gallifreyan. The Rani had undergone a transformation. She had not regenerated, at least as far as they could tell. She still wore the current face of Romana. Only now, it, along with the rest of her body, was completely healed. Her hair was clean and luxurious, her skin unblemished and restored to a flawless pale pink. Her dress, while still black, was no longer Romana's ruined old cream one. Now it was a deliberately chosen sleek gown of dominating darkness. The Rani sneered contemptuously at the doctor and his companions.
Ha!
She barked.
You see, dear doctor, how wrong you were once again. An immaculate track record of incompetency and ineptitude.
Here she raised her hands skywards in triumph. As she did this, the black smoky jets ceased emanating from them, and yet she did not fall. Clearly her powers were already growing, and she no longer needed those blasts to fly.
Everything is working exactly as I planned. The bulk is powering me, and yet is utterly oblivious in its generosity. Where once I bemoaned the bulk entity's ambivalence towards me, now I revel in it. They have become my unwitting slaves, less than slaves, cattle, to be milked by me for all eternity. Behold, the reign of the Rani.
Now the Rani's eyes fell from whatever imagined glories she envisioned in the middle distance to land upon the doctor and Romana with unwavering malice.
And now, since you have beheld the culmination of all my plans, witnessed my final victory and your own final terminal failure, I have no further use for you. Time, I think, to dispose of you both in one of my many handy rifts.
Romana and the doctor suddenly felt vice-like grips clutching their upper arms and chests.
They began to inch skywards under the pressure of the Rani. Then the doctor's eyes widened. He sought to cry out, yet due to the constriction could not find the breath. A freight train-sized tentacle slammed into the side of the Rani. It seemed to be making an almost leisurely journey from the nearest of the bulk rifts to another some way behind it. Only its terrible size gave the impression of sluggishness. No doubt, in reality, its speed was at least comparable to such a locomotive. Its random curved path had first brought it slightly closer to intersect with the Rani, before arcing away from the witnesses below. The doctor and Romana dropped to the floor as they were suddenly released, the Rani's concentration understandably broken. The Rani herself lay spread-eagled across the nose of this travelling tendril as it eased towards the next rift.
Oh no!
She shrieked in a mix of horror and frustration.
Not again!
Then she was carried into the rift and was gone. Unlike the previous bulk limb transition they had witnessed, this one did not suddenly reveal its tip emerging impossibly from the first rift. This tentacle clearly preferred to be more conventional. It reversed direction and began to withdraw back from whence it came. As its tip re-emerged from the more distant rift, there was no sign of the bulk-augmented Time Lord. The doctor sighed.
I tried to warn her,
he said sadly. Romana nodded with a twisted smile.
I know, and I do wish you wouldn't. Our antagonists are quite capable of doing enough damage without our help.
She then glanced once more at the receding appendage.
And we shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. We were lucky she literally didn't see the end coming. It's funny how often that seems the way with these ambitious, bright but flawed individuals. Be it the Master, the Rani, or even the recent dear, probably departed Dr. Nugati, they all appear utterly unable to conceive of any difficulties or problems with their plans until it hits them in the face. Or back. It seems they never learn.
The doctor nodded appreciatively.
a man or woman should know their limitations,
He pronounced sagely. Their philosophical musings were interrupted by a distant double crack. Looking towards the horizon, they could see the twin ears of the Anubis monument had been knocked off by yet another tentacle, travelling between rifts. And it was far from alone in this journey. The sky was becoming a veritable can of worms. Romana frowned at the point on the horizon where the stone ears had once been.
Anubis won't be pleased,
Came her assessment. Shh! The doctor hissed warningly, but with a hint of mischief.
he might well be listening.
Then he became more pensive.
Even if he were, it would be unlikely he would or could do anything.
In fact, we could rather do with a little Suskind intervention.
But those same 11-dimensional Witten obstacles remain. Indeed, I'd say have multiplied.
Romana pursed her lips at the doctor.
Is there any chance this damage to the Rani's battery might close the rifts, save the universe?
The doctor shook his head grimly, gesturing round at the rift-strewn sky.
I doubt the bulk cares one jot for the Rani's devices any more. The doors are open, and they have numerous feet in them. No, there is only one way they can be closed.
Here he paused to summon up the strength to continue.
Which is?
Susan prompted gently. The doctor's eyes flicked between those of the two female Gallifreyans.
From the other side.
Now he turned to Captain Povey.
My dear Captain,
He began calmly, patiently, and politely.
I'm going to have to ask a great deal from you. I need the A-36 to fly into the bulk, fitted with some additional equipment. Once there, it will, with luck, pull closed those rifts and seal our universe off from the rest of the bulk for all eternity. But, in the process, seal itself inside with the rest of the bulk. Never to be seen again.
The doctor stared intently at the captain, awaiting his response. The captain, in his turn, frowned back at the doctor, his face hard and grim. Finally he spoke.
Doctor,
He began stiffly.
you and I are not friends. I would say we do not get on very well at all.
In fact, you have been a source of constant troubles in the brief time you have spent on board my ship. Giving you access to the ship again would be the last thing on my mind."
The doctor's eyes fell, and he looked downcast. He took a deep breath, preparing for battle.
"Nevertheless,"
Captain Povey continued, robbing him of the chance to speak,
"I'm not blind, you fool. I can see that not allowing you on my ship might well be the last thing on my mind ever, if I were to enact such a thought. The universe is clearly falling apart. It is riven with clams of death. Clams of death well known to you and I since we travelled through one ourselves together in the recent past. And only through your efforts did we survive and ultimately escape. I may not like the idea of me and my ship being used for such a purpose, and I'm likely never to hold you warmly in my heart, but I must respect your past results and acknowledge your expertise and experience. The A36 is at your disposal."
The doctor nodded slowly in appreciation of the captain's good sense and sacrifice. "Thank you," he said simply to the Albion officer.
"Right,"
the captain barked decisively.
"let's get the ship crewed up and ready to get underway."
The doctor smiled sorrowfully at the captain. "You said the A36 was at my disposal, and I thank you, and I shall hold you to that. This is a one-way trip, and one which, with a little help from the extra equipment I shall install, it shall take without you or your crew." The captain frowned deeply at the doctor in profound annoyance, but remained silent. Sub-Lieutenant Leslies looked profoundly relieved.
"Steady as she goes,"
he said, smiling nervously. Captain Povey clipped him round the back of his head, sending the first officer's hat flying. "This is a journey I shall make alone," the doctor pronounced solemnly.
I'm coming with you.
This determined declaration came from Susan. The doctor pulled himself up to his full height. "No, Susan, I need you to stay here." Susan looked both defiant and deeply hurt.
You cannot, after all this time, expect me to lose you once again.
The doctor gave a sad half smile. "Think of it less as losing a grandfather and more as gaining a TARDIS and a K9. I need you to stay here with both to ensure the safety of our entire universe. If my plan should fail, you will be the last thing standing against, well, the end of the universe. And K9 will be there to help, naturally. Even if my plan is successful, someone needs to, at the very least, ensure the Rani's battery and satellites are truly out of commission, ideally for good. And thereafter, it would be useful to have someone keeping an eye on things. I'd hate for my sacrifice to be for naught." Susan looked pained, her eyes seeking the floor. But, much as with Captain Povey a moment before, she could offer no further objections. Now the doctor turned to Romana. "Obviously, there is no need for both of us to man the A36 and fly into the bulk. Your help here, in this universe, would prove invaluable." Romana nodded slowly, then punched him hard in the shoulder.
"Ow!"
the doctor cried.
"What was that for?"
Romana scowled at him, shaking her head.
"You are an idiot,"
she snapped at him.
"I would have thought by now you would have known better. But it seems it is not just our antagonists who are slow learners. Did you learn nothing from what I said after we fixed the universe the first time? When we stood in that trap street alley on Earth? Or what I told you on Hungaria after your heroic suicide attempt there?"
The doctor frowned at her, looking a little peeved. Romana smiled wearily and shook her head once more.
"I know you mean well in what you say,"
she said, her tone softening a little.
"but I think, once again, you are shouldering just a tad too much responsibility. 2 heads are better than 1, just as 4 hearts are better than 2. If something were to go wrong, the universe forbid, and you were somehow incapacitated or needed to be in 2 places at once, your selflessness could destroy the entire universe."
Romana stared him determinedly in the eyes, a smile there, but in no way lessening her resolve.
"If it's all the same with you, I think I shall be in this to the bitter end."
The doctor could not suppress a grim little smile. Far be it from me to debate your profound wisdom, he said with the slightest of bows. Romana slapped him again on that same shoulder, only this time with the back of her hand and a little more gently. Now the doctor turned back to the rest of their companions and clapped his hands briskly. Now, as I'm sure you can see, we can waste no more time, lest time and space itself gets wasted. With that, the doctor, Romana, Susan and K9 dashed to the TARDIS and ran inside. Meanwhile, Captain Povey jogged over to the lift in the mooring tower and picked up a telecom handset, which acted as a direct line to the A-36.
Chief Petty Officer Twerpy, get your cleaning crew off now. The ship is needed, but you are not. All you need to know is secret orders. Get down here, quick smart.
Sub-Lieutenant Leslies just stood where everyone had left him, smiling awkwardly in case he was needed, but hoping he was not. Chief Petty Officer Twerpy and a couple of additional seamen in his unit were just exiting the lift at ground level when the three Time Lords and K9 reappeared from the TARDIS. K9 was clearly not going to get very far, since a cable coiled from his inspection hatch and was obviously attached to something inside. And this tether was not alone. Another thinner cable spiraled from his nose and fed into a brass and wooden box carried by Susan. It had a telescopic tripod attached to its base, which she deployed, then busied herself studying the various displays and switches covering its upper surfaces. Meanwhile, the Doctor and Romana were similarly encumbered with a disparate collection of mostly obscure devices and hardware. One identifiable exception was the crown-like half of the four-dimensional stress set, the FDSS, which had been worn by K9 in the not-too-distant past. The Doctor glanced down at the metal dog and paused. K9, he said seriously, be a good boy.
Affirmative, Master.
K9 chirruped obediently. The Doctor nodded once to his metal companion, then he and Romana dashed over to where Captain Povey and his men stood by the lift. They hurriedly dumped their gear in the elevator car before returning to Captain Povey himself. I fear this is where we part company, my dear Captain. If you would join my granddaughter over there, she has communication and monitoring equipment. We might need your advice if we run into any difficulties with your ship. Povey looked far from friendly and seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict. Finally, he huffed and extended a hand towards the Doctor. The Time Lord looked at it for a moment as if it were a halibut. Then he grasped it, and the Captain shook it firmly.
Good luck, Doctor, and Godspeed,
he said, then released his grip. The Doctor gave a wry smile. Thank you, sir. And which god? He asked cheekily.
Whichever is fastest,
Captain Povey quipped back. Then, much to Romana's surprise, he turned and extended his hand towards her. Eyebrows raised, she took it, and the Captain repeated his earlier action.
And good luck to you, Miss Romana. I hope you will keep him out of trouble. And vice versa,
he concluded, smiling grimly. Romana gave a single chuckle and nodded her thanks. They then all looked at a sky riddled with rifts and boiling with twisting nightmarish tendrils. At that moment, an errant tentacle struck the main envelope of the A-36 airship. While only a glancing blow in the grand scheme of things, from the perspective of the Albion spaceship, it was potentially catastrophic. The tail of the ship slewed round sickeningly. This was not necessarily a major problem, as the entire top section of the mooring mast was designed to swivel to account for the changing wind direction. The real problem lay in the new twist it was acquiring in the vertical direction, looking as though it was in the process of keeling over to port. The attachment mechanism had far less leeway for motion in that direction. If it snapped, the A-36 could be lost forever. And with it, the universe. Everyone held their breaths as the ship keeled over to an angle of 45 degrees. Here it paused. Then, with aching slowness, it began to self-right, creeping towards an even keel. Everybody finally exhaled. They knew the time for pleasantries was past, and the two Time Lords jumped back into the lift, while Captain Povey closed its metal lattice gate from outside. He watched with mixed emotions as the Doctor and Romana rose to take command of his vessel for one final, vital mission. Romana and the Doctor raced on board the archaic-looking spacecraft and immediately set to work preparing for launch. They closed the front ramp through which they had entered at the nose of the ship, and haired through that vast space where the cargo and gas bags were stored. They descended steep metal steps into the standard class accommodation section of the gondola. All was eerily quiet, the absence of passengers and crew seeming to have robbed the ship of life and warmth. 2 people just could not fill it. Of course, this vessel was dwarfed by that which they had left behind. However, this knowledge did little to dispel the sense of loneliness and isolation. They left the standard class accommodation via a heavy metal security door and entered the corridor to the bridge. They paused briefly at the small telecom room while Romana installed some extra equipment to boost its flexibility and range. Then she and the doctor moved to the very front of the gondola, the flight deck. The immense wrap-around windows gave them a fantastic view of Cairo Aerodrome and its surrounds. It also gave them an unsettling ability to witness the rift-torn sky. They shuddered, then set about installing the rest of the equipment, including the FDSS. Finally, everything was in place. "Shall we get underway?" the doctor asked softly. Romana sighed.
There's no time like the present, and if we don't leave soon, there won't even be that.
She answered with resignation. The doctor nodded and flipped on the telecom extension in the main control panel. "Captain Povey, release the docking clamp," the doctor requested. The captain gave no reply, but the Time Lords heard the clank of the mechanism disengaging. They began to feel a shift in the pit of their stomachs as the vessel started to drift free of the mooring mast at the mercy of the air currents. Hastily, the doctor turned on the 6 turboprop motors and grabbed the main wheel, while Romana rolled her eyes at his oversight. The motors roared into life, and they were no longer adrift. They were underway, with the doctor at the helm. Romana stood at his side, adjusting the controls. Even with the additional technology they had installed, controlling a ship designed for a crew of at least a dozen was no easy task for just 2 pairs of hands. Nevertheless, the ship obeyed their commands, rising majestically and turning to face the largest and closest of the rifts. There was still much tentacle traffic moving between the rifts currently visible. Romana and the doctor exchanged dubious glances. This was going to be very dicey. The doctor and Romana gunned the engines, setting all 6 to maximum thrust. The rift grew in the front window until it entirely filled the view ahead. Suddenly, the tip of a tentacle was heading straight for the cockpit glass. The doctor grunted as he spun the wheel, Romana wrestling with the flaps. The ship slewed sideways sluggishly. Yet it was enough. The tentacle barely grazed the main envelope as it passed and, although it did jostle the ship slightly, miraculously caused no damage. The rift was far wider than the emerging tentacle, and the doctor now steered straight towards an unobstructed patch of the sickening maelstrom within. "Activate the FDSS and the bulk protection field," the doctor cried to Romana. From the ground, Susan, Captain Povey and the others saw a shimmering curtain of energy erupt as a ring around the center of the A-36, then spread fore and aft. This energy field narrowed as it reached the prow and the stern. The entire spacecraft was enveloped in this hazy glowing shroud. Captain Povey recognized it as the one which had protected them from the most maddening effects of the bulk, the last time his ship had been accidentally drawn into that hellish realm. On board ship, the doctor turned to Romana. "I removed the Time Meddler's space-time stabilization circuit from our TARDIS and installed it here along with the FDSS. Working in tandem, they should be able to seal the rifts once we are in the bulk, of course. And once there, it should allow us to travel freely around the 11-dimensional realm at will." Romana nodded slowly.
Just never return,
she said in a subdued manner. The doctor nodded, equally grimly. "At least not to this universe. Our universe, no," he agreed, and placed a hand on her shoulder to reassure her. To reassure him, in her turn, she allowed him to keep it there. The A-36 passed through the rift and was swallowed by the bulk. All this had been witnessed by Susan, Captain Povey and K9, monitoring the situation from the ground.
But this was not the last they heard of the Doctor and Romana. A speaker on the brass and wooden box Susan was manning spluttered into life. "Susan, my child, we are now inside the bulk," came the Doctor's voice, calm and serious.
Grandfather, we are receiving you.
Susan responded into an extended microphone, her voice a little tremulous. There was a short pause. "I am activating the space-time stabilization circuit via the FDSS now," the Doctor announced with a flourish. There was a crack, louder than any thunder, and more like a fracturing of a giant femur. And not just one crack, it came from every rift, only with slight delays and decreasing volume depending upon their distance from those watching. Within moments, all the tentacles had retracted and disappeared. However, the rifts remained.
They're closing!
Captain Povey cried. Although subtle and difficult to discern, it seemed the Albion officer was correct. The speaker crackled into life again. "It is done," came the Doctor's voice with a note of finality. Then he drew breath and spoke once more. "Listen, Susan, please," he began. "I'm so glad you came back, and I'm so sorry I did not make good on my word and make this day arrive all the sooner, and under better circumstances."
Yes, Grandfather, I just wish we had more time.
Then came another pause from the comms unit. Susan imagined the Doctor shaking his head sadly. "Time," he finally said wistfully. "It always comes down to time." Then his voice strengthened when next he spoke. "And yet, for all those years we had together, I'm eternally grateful. During those years, I took care of you, and you, in return, took care of me. Now it is time for you to shoulder a different burden. You're still my grandchild, and always will be, but now you have to take over from me. The universe needs a watchful eye, and more, it needs a generous spirit to take care of it. I know you, Susan, and I know what you are capable of. I know the universe is in safe hands. Your future lies in the TARDIS, and not with a silly old buffer like me. There must be no regrets, no tears, no anxieties. Just go forward in all your beliefs and prove to me that I am not mistaken in mine. Goodbye, Susan. Goodbye, my dear." Susan's throat seized up then, and even if she had found words to match her emotions, she would have been unable to utter them. Staring up with glistening eyes, she could see all the rifts had narrowed to jagged glowing cracks in the sky, in many cases almost too thin to see. Now Romana's voice came over the speaker.
"The lives of great men all remind us we may make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. Never be cruel, never be cowardly. Laugh hard, run fast, be kind."
She reminded those listening with solemn gravitas. "Oh, wise words indeed, Romana. I couldn't have put it better myself," came the Doctor's approving tones one final time. Then there came another chorus of thunderclaps, echoing throughout time and space, as all of the rifts of the 11-dimensional bulk snapped shut, never to return. Thunder crashed and lightning flashed across a cloud-strewn night sky, draped ominously over the Noria swamp. Heavy drops of rain clattered from the foliage of the jungle surrounding the marsh, while still more pelted and blatted into the blue mud of the trisilicate mine itself. The weather was sick and tired of being accused of pathetic fallaciousness. It meant what it said, and its dark mood resonated strong and true. Bimbor the Boloid stared grimly out of a window of his official residence in the Noria mine's main settlement, his face stony, lost in thought. His two hands were planted firmly on the ground, supporting his spherical blue-furred body, at a respectable 1.5 meters from palms to fluffy crown.
His yellow trumpet bell of a mouth was pursed in worry, while his glowing discs of eyes glowered into the middle distance. Recent disappearances of several of his boloid people, seemingly at random, without rhyme or reason, played heavy upon his mind. Piled on this were further troubling reports of damaged or stolen equipment from the mine, as well as disturbingly similar vandalism and thefts occurring within the settlement itself. At that moment, the door was thrown open by another spherical boloid dashing in, aided by the forceful gust of wind from the storm beyond.
Bloody hell, Bori!
Bimbor snapped at the newcomer impatiently.
Were you born in a bloody barn?
Bori made no efforts to close the door, such was the urgency of his news.
Chief Representative,
He cried desperately.
the chirpers are revolting.
Bimbor snorted derisively.
And in other news, boloids secrete in the swamp. Tell me something I don't know.
Bori shook his head, a little like a dog drying itself.
No, sir, you don't understand. We've finally seen it. Attacks on the mud extraction gear as they happened.
Bimbor stared intently at his boloid subordinate.
What do you mean? What happened?
Bori looked despondent.
Night had fallen, and some of us were making final checks to make sure all was secure ahead of the coming storm. Then they came. Chirpers, dozens of them, flying from the surrounding jungle, throwing things, dropping things. They pushed over equipment, carried some off. They even carried off one of my men.
Bimbor's frown deepened. As he mulled over this disturbing report, another sound arose outside, competing with the howling wind. An odd, rasping, wheezing noise. Probably due to the sounds of the storm, it went unnoticed by the boloids.
These are grim tidings indeed, young Bori.
Bimbor pronounced seriously.
I'd say we've not seen trouble like this since the time the Chittids went crazy for Earthmen. But that was decades ago, and then we were lucky enough to get some outside help. Yes, he was rather handy at the time. It's a pity we don't have the doctor here to help us now.
A woman stepped through the still-open door behind Bori. She was dressed in long black robes, with her head unbound, her dark brown bob framing a face of maturity and experience, complete with secret smile. In her right hand she held what looked like a gnarled twig or stick, except the glowing blue light at its tip belied its technological origins. A grey metallic dog now trundled through that same door to wait for instructions obediently at her feet. Ghosts of sadness, the memories of recent loss, flitted across the countenance of the woman formerly known as Susan. Then they were past, the enigmatic smile restored.
I'm a doctor.
She offered helpfully, fixing Bimbor with a steely stare.
But probably not the one you were expecting.
Masters? Mistresses?
The Doctor requires materials in order to maintain the TARDIS and ensure continued functionality. He similarly requires carbon-based comestibles to sustain his own biological functions and existence. Master would never say this, but he requires aid beyond that supplied by this unit in order to acquire these. To aid the Doctor in his various tasks and creations, this can be most effectively achieved via Patreon or Substack subscriptions, or through donations directly to PayPal. Or if you desire physical goods in return for your contributions, written accounts of my travels with the Doctor are also available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. Thank you, Masters, Mistresses.